Do you have a number in your head that you think? Did you ever sit back and think about it?
It's safe to say I couldn't count that much. That is, say something get jumbled. I would say it's well over 80.
Do you think that many?
Well over. I done in Florida, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Baltimore. That any place within driving distance that was not connected to me, I was right. My own thing was not to make a pattern, which I never did. I never to try to kill them the exact same way or to, leave a signature. I wasn't stupid, That was the thing with me. I wasn't a serial killer.
No, if you just told me that you killed over 80, that fits the definition pretty well.
No, it doesn't.
But I know what you think, because you told me in the past that you've been many more that you let go.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
In other words, I didn't go out to kill somebody. Most anyone I killed was when I would be somehow connected to them, and I didn't want to get caught. It was more than just not getting caught. I was just thinking about myself.
What do you mean? Meaning like somebody might have seen her get in the car, or
yeah, like in the Bergen Law. I walked around the law. I walked in the parking lot, followed her into the parking lot. Anybody could sit in the car. To me, in my mind, I don't know if anybody's seen me.
So what was the drill? Was it more rape? Control? Tying up?
The game. It was being able to get away with it. The stalking. To be able to do it, it was like the perfect murder every time.
Better known as the Times Square Ripper or the Torso Killer, this is Richard Cottingham at 68 years of age. Officially, investigators were able to link him to 18 cases and formally charge him with 9. Richard claims the number exceeds 80. Whether this figure is exaggerated to draw attention or not, we will likely never know. With extremely violent attacks, he became one of the worst serial killers in United States history. The brutality involved in his crimes terrified not just one, but several entire states. With an intelligence level well above average, he claims to have committed at least 8 so-called perfect crimes. It sounds strange coming from someone who now views life through the bars of a prison cell. Refusing to see himself as a serial killer and claiming he felt no pleasure in killing is an attempt to minimize his own actions, a move to distance himself from the image of a monster. Richard knows exactly what he is and what he did. Wearing clothes provided by the state, he spent hours describing to investigators in detail how he killed each of his victims. He did so while eating pizza and laughing. In December of 1977, then-Detective Alan Grickle encountered a mysterious case in New Jersey. A young married woman had been reported missing. She lived in an apartment in Little Ferry and vanished under suspicious circumstances. Maryanne Carr, 26 years old, also known as Marcy, was a nurse who worked as an X-ray machine operator at a hospital. The person who contacted the police to report her disappearance was her husband. He was traveling on business when it happened. Maryanne had plans to meet her mother-in-law that day, but never showed up. When her husband was informed, he immediately contacted the police. The detective arrived at the apartment and found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of forced entry and no broken windows. Maryanne had simply disappeared. The detective's only glimmer of hope came from a neighbor. He lived in the same building and was backing out of the parking lot when he noticed someone in his rear-view mirror. At the time, he assumed it was Maryanne's husband. The problem was, the husband was out of town on business during that period. Maryanne's husband bore a physical resemblance to a former resident of that complex, a successful man who worked in the technology sector alongside early computer systems. That man was Richard Francis Cottingham. He worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield, a large insurance company located in the heart of Manhattan. Richard remained with the company for over 10 years. His co-workers described him as highly intelligent, punctual, and passionate about reading, especially material related to medicine. Richard had great communication skills and appeared well-spoken. He eventually became a leader within his team. For context, at the time, 4 entire floors were required just to house the technology operation. These computers demanded enormous physical space, and their operators were often seen as outsiders. According to one of Richard's colleagues, he could never sit still. His body constantly shifted in his chair, and his leg never stopped moving. He maintained that same restless energy for 8 or 9 hours every single day. From the window high up in that building, Richard could see a large river. On the other side, in New Jersey, a detective was beginning the investigation into Maryanne's disappearance. That same detective arrived at a motel near the airport. A body had been found in the parking lot. The victim was a woman. She was wearing a white nurse's uniform and was barefoot. Maryanne Carr's case was officially reclassified from a missing person to a homicide. Her 26-year-old body was found lifeless between the curb and a fence in the parking lot. Her wrists and ankles bore deep marks consistent with the use of restraints. Marks on her neck suggested strangulation as the cause of death. At the time, police concluded that Maryanne had not been killed in the parking lot. She had died elsewhere, and her body was transported there. However, no additional evidence was found. Investigators could not determine how she arrived at the parking lot, why she was left there, or who was responsible. And this would not be the last time police returned to that parking lot. The nightmare was only beginning. The investigation soon reached an impasse. In a world without cameras or cell phones, police faced serious obstacles in identifying the perpetrator. Meanwhile, a series of violent attacks near the airport began to surface. The motive appeared to be forced intimate acts. All the victims were women. Some were found unconscious inside motel rooms. Others were discovered lifeless along the roadside. The vast majority were sex workers operating in New York City. And there was someone particularly interested in their services in that area, someone who spent his days surrounded by monitors and cables. According to his co-workers, Richard liked to share his experiences with sex workers. That was his main topic of interest during breaks and lunch hours. He appeared to be drawn to aggressive and humiliating practices during the act and frequented establishments that catered to people with the same interests. Paraphilias are very common among serial killers. Even when married, they often turn to sex workers as a way to satisfy their fantasies. These women frequently become victims either before or after the encounter. Because they are difficult to track and often have little contact with family members, they become the perfect targets for these criminals. At the time, the disappearances of these women were rarely reported, and police showed little interest in pursuing the cases. Richard did not hide from his co-workers that he went straight from work to Times Square. New York City was very different from what it is today. Times Square functioned as a showcase for sex workers looking for clients. These women positioned themselves in strategic locations, such as subway entrances and exits, street corners, and inside bars and restaurants. 8th Avenue had the highest concentration of them. Some of these women were very young and had recently run away from home for various reasons. With no money and no direction, they were approached by pimps who offered them a place on the streets, places that were becoming increasingly visible. Their faces only made it to the newspapers because their bodies were found along the roads. All of them were brutally attacked, and their bodies showed severe signs of assault and, in some cases, mutilation. The most dangerous part for a serial killer is the abduction. Having a woman willingly enter a stranger's vehicle without raising suspicion to outsiders eliminates that risk. No social skills are required, only money. This is another reason why this victim profile is so common among serial killers. To meet the demand of Times Square at the time, many low-quality motels were built. One of these establishments had an investor interested in keeping it operating. That man was Richard. He always carried large amounts of cash with him. This was the bait used to take women from New York to New Jersey. But there was a problem. Richard hated paying for the act, and he had another strategy before he began killing them. After the encounter, Richard would somehow convince the woman to stay the night in the room. Once she fell asleep, he would steal her clothes and belongings and leave the motel without paying the bill. She would wake up with no money and no clothes, eventually ending up in front of the police when she admitted she had no way to pay for the room. He repeated this behavior several times, and it is impossible to say why he spared the lives of those women. For others, perhaps those who refused to stay the night, their bodies began appearing dumped along the roads, and they were starting to accumulate. One of the victims was found at the airport motel. She had entered her client's car and stopped at a bar called Flennan's. According to her, she does not remember anything after that, not leaving the bar nor entering the motel. She was one of the women who survived an encounter with the serial killer. Blood and urine tests revealed high levels of alcohol and drugs. She remembered consuming the alcohol, but not the drugs, suggesting the substance had been placed in her drink at some point. She was found unconscious by one of the motel employees, and the police were called. Numerous signs of assault covered her body. She had been restrained and severely beaten, especially in the chest and intimate areas. The attack was extremely violent, and she had to be taken to the hospital. The injuries left her close to death, but she was able to recover and survive. Because the victims had no connection to one another, police had difficulty linking the crimes. Some women were killed, others were not. At the time, law enforcement was not inclined to accept testimony from sex workers. They were viewed as unreliable sources of information. This gave the serial killer the freedom to continue his attacks. On December 2, 1979, the next body was found, and this time the entire city would come to a halt. At approximately 9 a.m., an employee at the Travelodge Motor Inn noticed smoke in one of the corridors. It was coming from room 417, where a "Do Not Disturb" sign hung from the door handle. The fire department was called and arrived to control the fire. Once the smoke cleared and the hotel was evacuated, police entered the scene. 2 female bodies were found inside room 417. The women were naked and had been affected by the flames, but they were already dead before the fire began. They were located on separate beds. The first woman was never identified. Many years later, the second was identified as Did Godarsi, a 22-year-old Iranian immigrant who worked as a sex worker. There was a reason they were not identified on the same day. Did's hands and head had been removed from her body through blade strikes. The second victim also had her hands severed and her head decapitated. According to the serial killer, he later stated that he did this to prevent the victims from being identified. Both women displayed extensive bruising across their bodies. Police determined that the beds were the point of origin of the fire. With the women already dead and mutilated, the killer set the beds on fire and left the scene. The horrific scene terrified not only police officers and firefighters, but society as a whole. This was not an aggressive, intimate act that had simply gotten out of control. The women did not lose their heads by accident. The first victim was never identified and is believed to have been between 16 and 22 years old. She is often referred to as Manhattan Jane Doe. The room had been rented by someone identifying himself as Carl Wilson, a false name used by Richard. The room had been rented under that name since November 29th. The case gained massive attention, and in the absence of a real name, the media gave the killer his first nickname, the Times Square Ripper. The condition in which the bodies were found displayed a level of aggression rarely seen. Comparisons to Jack the Ripper were inevitable. There was nothing connecting this crime to the murder of Maryanne, which had occurred 2.5 years earlier. This is a key point in understanding how Richard operated. He did not have a single modus operandi, he had several. All of them began with the abduction of women, but not all of them were sex workers. Some were drugged and left alive in hotel rooms. Others were found dead along the sides of highways. The only common element among the cases was the level of aggression inflicted on the bodies. It is expected that after several attacks, a serial killer will seek new forms of stimulation. Richard did exactly that, but instead of adding new steps to an established method, he chose to create entirely new ones. What drew the most attention was also the most violent. Richard began mutilating his victims during and after the act. Severed heads and cut hands were among the scenes left behind. This chaos confused investigators, who were unable to connect one crime to another. Richard was not driven solely by the need to satisfy paraphilias. He enjoyed the sensation of committing a crime and not being caught. The feeling of being smarter than the police appeared to be one of his main incentives. He seemed proud of himself when stating that he knew how to commit the perfect crime, claiming that this knowledge came from his many tests with these women. Once again, police returned to the same parking lot where Maryanne Carr had been found 2.5 years earlier. One of the hotel maids noticed a strong odor coming from one of the beds while changing the sheets. She searched for the source but could not find it. That was when she decided to lift the mattress. Her terrified eyes landed on the body of a naked woman, handcuffed and already in an advanced state of decomposition. She left the room immediately and called the police. This is a scene that is difficult to process, even for experienced officers. The maid was traumatized for the rest of her life. Police entered room 132 of the Hasbrook Heights Hotel. The handcuffed woman was identified as Valerie Ann Street, a 19-year-old sex worker. Identifying the body was difficult because the young woman had checked into the hotel using a false name, something common in that line of work. After examining the body, the medical examiner noticed a large wound in the victim's lower back, apparently caused by a sharp object. At the time, it was believed to have been a blade. These were marks of torture. The women were now being brutally tortured, with mutilations occurring both during and after the intimate act with the serial killer. Assaults of many different forms were carried out to satisfy his desires. In the end, strangulation was the method chosen to cause death. This type of violence, beyond requiring physical proximity, gives the offender a sense of control and power, something highly sought after by serial killers. They look for ways to prolong the victim's suffering while making it clear that survival is not an option. These are deeply disturbed individuals who stop only with death or arrest. Richard was still free and alive. Police realized that an extremely dangerous individual was at large. Despite the lack of evidence connecting the crimes, investigators were already operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a serial killer, one who was not afraid to return to the crime scene. Valerie was the second victim found at the same location. The killer was already convinced of his impunity and left no evidence behind. The police suspect list remained empty while bodies filled the headlines. No one would ever suspect the middle-aged man who spent his days working on a computer. Richard relied on that. The construction of a social mask is a crucial part of building a serial killer's double life. Validating one's character in the eyes of society through marriage is often the chosen method. Richard was no different. He married a woman named Janet in 1970. They had 3 children together and divorced in 1981 after his arrest. During that time, Richard carried out numerous attacks, which means he would return home to have dinner with his wife and children after violently murdering a woman in a hotel room. When he was not killing, Richard spent his time in establishments focused on sadomasochism. These experiences were shared openly with his coworkers. He once described seeing a woman walking through such a place with a man on a leash. The man was on all fours and was forced to lick a urinal. That was the level of submission and control Richard sought in his attacks. But unlike those environments, his acts were not consensual. During high school in Pascack Valley, Richard was part of the track and field team. He was never able to truly connect with his peers. Highly diplomatic, he formed friendships, but only shallow ones. Richard viewed himself as superior, too good to belong to any group. Some of his behaviors point to narcissistic personality traits from an early age. In high school, Richard was taller than most of his classmates and had an athletic build. This attracted the attention of several girls. However, he never had girlfriends. According to his peers, he was attracted to women while simultaneously speaking about them in a negative manner. Richard appeared to be especially fixated on breasts. However, there's a difference between being attracted to a woman based on a physical characteristic and being attracted exclusively to that body part, almost disconnecting the woman herself from the equation. This is where paraphilia, or abnormal interest, becomes evident. Now in his 30s, married and with children, Richard openly bragged about seeing sex workers. That changed when he contracted a venereal disease, now commonly referred to as an STD. From that day on, Richard began to despise sex workers and always referred to them in a negative way. This did not stop him from continuing to see them, but from that point forward, the attacks would become worse. 2 weeks after the second body was found in a hotel in New Jersey, the Times Square Ripper struck again. In another burned hotel room, the body of a sex worker was found lying on the bed. Both breasts had been removed with a blade and taken from the scene. As the attacks accumulated, death and the sexual act began to merge. It is common for serial killers to engage in sexual acts even after death because of this progression. A kind of ritual is established, significantly escalating the crime scene with each new victim. Richard continued scattering bodies across different states while police remained paralyzed by the lack of evidence. The frustration within law enforcement was as intense as the pressure coming from society. Since not all of the victims were sex workers, panic spread and women became afraid to go out at night. As happens in most cases like this, demand for firearms, guard dogs, and reinforced locks increased. With more than 10 bodies pointing to the same faceless offender, the serial killer returned for the 3rd time to the same crime scene, a motel in New Jersey. This time, he made a mistake. Hotel staff received a complaint about a fight in one of the rooms. The screams sounded serious, and a motel employee went to investigate. He knocked on the door to ask if everything was okay. After several minutes, the face of a woman appeared through the partially opened door. Her mouth said everything was fine. Her eyes begged for help. The employee immediately called the police. A patrol car arrived at the scene and found a man running through the parking lot. He had just left the building and was carrying a suitcase. His behavior appeared suspicious, and officers chased after him. He was caught and restrained. In his possession, police found several suspicious items, including handcuffs and tape, and he was unable to explain why he was carrying them. The man was taken to the police station and identified as Richard Francis Cottingham. Despite being arrested under these circumstances, he pleaded innocent. When confronted with the evidence, he admitted to having a problem with women. His wife was surprised by the call from the police and described Richard as a perfect husband and a devoted father. She denied having any knowledge of the crimes. Now, police needed evidence that could connect the serial killer to additional crimes in order to extract a confession. They then proceeded to his residence. It was a well-kept two-story house. Police attention quickly focused on the basement. There, they found a locked room to which only Richard had access. Few things are as suspicious as that. Having a space in a home that only one resident can enter is not common. That space was lined with numerous female items, objects taken from his victims and displayed as trophies. This was the private museum of a serial killer. Each item told a tragic story of extreme conditions, torture, and death. For Richard, it was a time machine that allowed him to relive his attacks. To him, those women were nothing more than objects, a means of bringing his fantasies into reality. The process of dehumanizing others is very common among serial killers, who at a certain point begin to view their victims as toys. Forensic teams spent the following days organizing and documenting the macabre collection. It became clear that he was the Times Square Ripper. The Torso Killer was another nickname attributed to Richard, due to the mutilations inflicted on his victims. Richard's work colleagues revealed his obsession with sex workers and sadomasochism. During the legal process, the serial killer took more notes than his own lawyer and appeared to be analyzing everyone around him at all times. He continued to deny being the Times Square Ripper, but was unable to explain the collection of items found in the basement. Richard was indeed intelligent, but not as intelligent as he believed himself to be. His natural arrogance was noted by more than one person in the courtroom. Regarding the incident in which he was arrested carrying handcuffs and tape, he claimed that the sexual acts had been consensual. The sex worker who had been with him, Leslie Ann Odell, denied any consent. Against his lawyer's advice, Richard agreed to answer the prosecutor's questions. Once again, he believed he was the smartest person in the room, and once again, he was not. The strategy used by the prosecution is usually to begin with questions the defendant is incapable of denying. For example, he was asked whether at the time of his arrest he was carrying handcuffs. The items were physically present, and he answered yes. 2 victims were found restrained with handcuffs, and marks consistent with their use were found on many others. The connection becomes automatic without the need to ask whether he restrained his victims, a question he would likely have denied. He was then asked whether he was carrying tape, which was also true. The mouths of his victims had been covered with tape. Marks and bite impressions were found on Leslie's body, the last woman attacked. This was also impossible to deny. Richard spent the next several minutes agreeing with the prosecutor while his lawyers sank into their chairs. The illusion of choice led Richard to confess his obsession with sadomasochism, which he attributed to excessive exposure to adult content. Richard had consumed such material from a very young age, still during school. How he gained access remains unknown. In addition to adult material, Richard was also addicted to all forms of gambling, and he would make one final bet with the state. During one of the breaks in the hearing, he threw a jacket toward the officer supervising him. When the officer uncovered his face, the serial killer was already gone. Richard ran and exited the building through a side door. Several officers pursued him. The chase lasted only a few minutes before Richard was captured. He was restrained and escorted back to the courtroom. The serial killer lost his bet and practically delivered a non-verbal confession. Richard Francis Cottingham was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree murder. Because the crimes occurred in different states, he was tried in both New York and New Jersey. The sentence was 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. In 2010, already incarcerated and divorced, he admitted to the murder of Noreen Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of two. She was killed inside a car in 1967. On June 19, 2014, Richard confessed to his crimes. Speaking to detectives as if they were his friends, he described his attacks and motivations, while also attempting to justify and minimize them. He smiled on several occasions and showed no visible signs of remorse. He claims to have killed more than 80 women, yet his name is officially linked to only 18 cases, of which only 9 were used in formal charges. The lack of evidence and recovered bodies makes it difficult to verify whether Richard's claims are true. He would not be the first criminal to confess to crimes he did not commit in order to inflate his numbers. With 2 life sentences, additional years of punishment become irrelevant. Now confined to a hospital bed, he continues to confess to more victims. Whether they exist or not, we will never know. What we do know is that some people are different. While in prison, Richard made a new friend. Her name is Jennifer West, the daughter of Degar D'Harsey, one of the serial killer's victims. She not only befriended the man who tortured and decapitated her mother, but also refers to him as a father figure. The expression on Richard's face in this photograph says everything that cannot be put into words. To be fair, Jennifer approached him to demonstrate forgiveness. Degar had lived in and out of prison, and most of her photographs were taken in police stations. Jennifer stated that her mother was never happy, and she wanted to see happiness exist somewhere. This connection later facilitated additional confessions from the serial killer. It is important to emphasize that Jennifer's motivation is a noble one, to discover where other bodies may be located. This is a difficult task, as appealing to the empathy of a serial killer rarely yields results. Regardless, their relationship remains one of friendship, and she maintains frequent contact with him. Today, at 78 years old, Richard Cottingham remains incarcerated at the South Woods State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey, where he is expected to spend the rest of his life.